everyone. I'm so excited to have you here another episode of Right Off Track. We have another amazing guest who's going to share his wisdom, his knowledge. You might have seen him all over LinkedIn popping up, and I've personally learned so much from him in my own interactions, and I'm excited to share that with you here. So I'm thrilled to introduce you to Nicholas Whitaker, a well-being coach, co-founder of Changing Work Collective, and the recent recipient of LinkedIn's Top Life Coaching Voice. With over 20 years of experience in the tech and media industries, Nicholas brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to his coaching practice. In this episode, we delve into his mission to help individuals flourish in conscious businesses while guiding them to avoid, escape, and recover from unhealthy work environments. As a specialist in empowering tech workers, Nicholas focuses on supporting those who feel stuck, overworked, undermined, and underappreciated. Through a unique blend of trauma-informed coaching, positive psychology, and research-backed methods, he assists his clients in finding confidence, balance, and well-being in their professional lives. By combining Buddhist principles with Stoic philosophy, Nicholas offers new perspectives and strategies to navigate the challenges of modern work culture. So join us in this episode as we explore the power of well-being coaching and discover practical strategies to create a fulfilling and meaningful career. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you so much. When I hear my bio read out by you, it just makes me feel like I'm doing a lot of really great things in the world. So thank you for putting that together. That's
you
amazing.
are. It's not just the feeling. It's what's happening for real. I love it.
I appreciate that. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And I know, just to give people some context, we connected on LinkedIn because you were somebody who was really sharing compassion and wisdom also around the theme of layoffs. And I was just impacted by the layoffs. So as a blessing in disguise, we connected because of those things coming about, me sharing my story around that. So I appreciate you connecting with me there and just taking this opportunity to also speak here to help others.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Really. I mean, it's unfortunately a club that a lot of us are in these days. And, one of the things that happened with me, like I was also laid off after 13 years in big tech back in January. And the first thing that I thought of was like, I need to reach out to other people that are experiencing the same thing, both to find community and to kind of find connection with those folks, but also to offer help. I feel like I had spent the whole year prior unknowingly preparing myself for being laid off in some ways. So I had done a lot of the work ahead of time, and it made just a ton of sense for me to like kind of leverage the work that I had done for myself and the training I had done in coaching and mindfulness and all of those things to really offer something to these folks who have been impacted by this really massive shock to their lives. So one of the, I guess the blessings in disguise from all of this has been able to connect with folks like yourself.
Thank you for saying that. And I think that even for me, having been at Meta for 7 years, for a while, right? You think like, oh, I've been there for a while. You see somebody who's maybe been at a big company for a while, like, well, he's already up there. Like, how can I interact with this person? And what I'm finding is that people want to help. People are people. Yeah. And so Nicholas is just a great example of that. He's very accessible. Not that you should bug him randomly, but he is a very accessible person. He does really reach out and respond and comment and support others. So let's go to a little bit of the backstory. I love that you mentioned that this whole journey has prepared you along the way, but can you maybe take us a little bit further back into like, why did you even get into this space? Why did you find it valuable?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I mean, so the story goes back pretty far. I think, originally I was introduced to mindfulness and meditation when I was still in middle school and high school, but it was very much kind of an academic and more of a philosophical type of an exposure. I grew up in corn country in central Pennsylvania. My family was blue collar, rode motorcycles, and I kind of like had this really interesting kind of exposure to mindfulness and meditation through this book, which a lot of people probably have heard of, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But the reason it caught my eye was not because of the Zen, it was because of the motorcycle maintenance component of it. And as it turns out, that book does not talk a lot about motorcycle maintenance at all. It's actually a story about a man and his son and kind of like this coming of age story for him. But it was like the first exposure that I had to these concepts around mindfulness and meditation. And around that same time, I had also grabbed another book that was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And at the time, way over my head, wasn't able to really kind of like internalize much of those practices, but it did give me enough exposure to the concepts around mindfulness and meditation so that when I was in times of stress or in distress. I had a pretty rocky childhood growing up. That was often something that I would turn to more as a kind of salve or as a soothing mechanism for whatever the anxiety was that I was experiencing. And it wasn't until like many, many years later that I had actually spent some time on silent retreat when I was on the East Coast in DC in the Baltimore region. And then later in life, when I moved to New York City, got involved in the Zen Center in Brooklyn and then the Shambhala Center in Manhattan, and really kind of made it more of a regular practice. And then, fast forward to roughly around 2010, 2011, 2012 era, I joined Google and found within the Google community these really beautiful offerings for GPAWS, which was the meditation and mindfulness community at Google, and then eventually the Search Inside Yourself training and community there. So it was kind of this like evolution over time, and it was really born out of necessity for a large part of my life. It was often centered around moments of stress or moments of strife of some kind. And it was only after like a long period of going on a regular basis that it started to become more of a way of life and something I was actually integrating into my day to day. And, fast forward even further, several years into my career at Google, I had the opportunity to get further training. I ended up doing a teacher certification training with Jack Cornfield and Tara Brock. And then went into doing trainings with other folks like the Inner MBA program, which is more focused on emotional intelligence and mindfulness, and then started doing coaching training as well. And for me, it was really a journey of wanting to give back. There was so much that I had learned from these practices, and I had found so much benefit in my own life dealing with my own mental health struggles that it felt like this pull towards something new. So I just kept saying yes to that. I kept getting more training and kind of fell into that as like a side hustle alongside what I was doing as my main day job. And then, fast forward even further along, earlier this year when I got laid off, it wasn't even a question for me. It was like, well, now's the time. If not now, when? Let's step fully into this and make this my full-time job and see where this can take me.
That's beautiful. And I appreciate you sharing some of the challenges along the way. And I love the part about the book. It found you perfectly. I had no clue that such a book existed, but what a perfect way to draw you into that at that point in your life. So mindfulness just creeps in subtly.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, I think it's a good reminder for me too, in terms of the way that I offer my services to folks is like really meeting people where they're at. And if it's a book talking about motorcycle maintenance and meditation, if that's the way it gets into into somebody's consciousness, like by all means, like that's the way to do it. It worked for me.
We talked about the Meow Meow podcast just a little bit
that's
earlier.
A whole other thing. It's going to happen someday.
We'll talk about your real podcast here in a moment because that's going to be very, very helpful. But I want to get back into a serious topic about the wellness of our mental well-being and health. And a lot of people are struggling for a variety of reasons, right? We just came out of a global pandemic. There's a lot of challenges just from that. And now a lot of people are going through the layoffs or feeling the effects of that. What kind of message do you have for them? What are you doing that could help those people right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the mental health crisis in the United States in particular, but also globally, I think has become very obvious. There's a lot more talk about it these days. There's a lot more research coming out. Like the Surgeon General has even said things here in the United States, and the World Health Organization has been talking about these things in terms of burnout, mental well-being, and stress in general. And I think you're right. I think the pandemic was really the catalyst to a lot of this dialogue being more regularly spoken about. In corporate America, where I was at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a massive amount of attention put on well-being and mental health. We had mental health days, we had EAP services provided for us, there was listening groups and all these other things. And what I noticed over time is that there was this kind of like, let's get back to work kind of mentality that started to happen within these environments where it's like, like, we know that you're stressed, we know that you might be burnt out, but we have this bottom line that we need to hit. And unfortunately, I think that's kind of been where things have shifted, more over the last year or so. And I almost even question whether or not we are out of a pandemic at this point too. It's still happening out there. Like people are still getting sick. It's not as bad as it was by any means. And we're not isolated as much as we were, but the repercussions of that event, that global mass trauma, if you will, is still being felt today. And, in terms of mental health and well-being, I think a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the discussion was around like what you can do for yourself as an individual. Like take your mental health day, take your vacation, spark joy in your life, which is all really good advice. But, what I feel is the more important thing are like, what are the environments and what are the systems that are being created which foster well-being and foster mental health? And there's a huge gap right now, I think, in what's being offered to people within the workplace and even outside the workplace. I mean, if you are in California, for example, I'm actually in Boulder, Colorado, but like for folks that are in California, it's incredibly difficult to find a therapist. That's even if you're willing to go look for a therapist in the first place. That's a whole other topic, which we probably don't have time to talk about here in this podcast. But, there's a stigma around mental health, and there's a stigma around things like burnout where people aren't even willing to self-identify as needing help or even being willing to ask for help. So, from my perspective, a big piece of the work that I'm doing is really trying to destigmatize the conversation around mental health and well-being, to have bigger conversations about what it's like to live with mental health challenges, particularly within the workplace, but beyond that, and then offer services and offer support for folks who are struggling with that. And my kind of ideal client is basically myself 2 or 3 years ago. It's that type A overachiever, working really hard, struggling at work. Yeah. And like feeling as if they might be like sliding backwards or otherwise not performing at the level that they need to. And what I experienced, which is like the very first symptom of burnout, was, oh, let me try harder. Let me work harder. And that will somehow solve the issue that I'm experiencing. And what that does is it just further accelerates burnout and it further accelerates mental health collapse. So, for me, it's a bit of an advocacy angle. Like, let's talk about this. Let's get these conversations happening more regularly. But it's also more of an active approach where I'm offering services. I'm offering my own wisdom and experience and training to help people through these periods in time.
That's lovely. And if you don't mind me adding, I was at Meta for a while, and I also had the tendency to overdo, right? You're working really hard, meeting the goals, and that feels normal in that environment and where everybody is working really hard. But there was a point where I got to realize, well, everything on paper looks great, right? I have the job, I have a lovely family and all of that, which I'm very grateful for, but I'm always stressed out.
Yeah.
And if that's the success that I'm working for, that can't be the only way. It was my really deep thought inside me. That can't be the only way, is just to work harder and always be stressed, no matter how on paper I have everything that you should want to have. And I'm not even fully appreciating that. So that's where I looked for programs like Search Inside Yourself that was offered at Meta. But even beyond that, I talked to my coworkers, and they mentioned how they went and used Lyra. That was the consulting group or mental health group that was offered at Meta. And because somebody said that was okay or shared their story, that gave me the courage, let's say, to reach out. Because in my head, well, I'm not necessarily depressed and I'm not taking light of that at all. But I was like, I'm not maybe severely depressed, but I'm definitely feeling that. And I realized, well, I don't need to be severely on the spectrum of deep trouble to reach out for help. Right.
Exactly.
It's like a workout, right? You don't wait like a year and start something grand. Like you can start pumping up and working on that muscle gradually, so you're in good health along the way, and just checking yourself, where do you need support? So I think that's great that we're putting attention to that, because more people, when they see others doing it, they normalize it and see the value for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that to me is a big part of actually my own healing process. But also I think, as a heteronormative presenting white male in America, I feel like I have a certain privilege and a certain platform to make sure that I'm speaking about these things. If you look at the statistics right now, the most at-risk community for suicide are men of a certain age. It's basically me. It's me,
Wow.
or folks like me. And it's not being discussed widely enough. And, most folks, if they were to like interact with me at work, they'd be like, oh yeah, Nick's got everything going on. He's got a car, and like, he's got the wife and the cats and the house, and like, he lives in Colorado, and he, goes out into nature all the time.
Right.
And he's doing all these things for the mindfulness community, but no one really asked like, hey, are you okay?
Hmm.
How are you dealing with this pandemic? How are you dealing with the stresses of work? And I think you touched on something that's really important, Anya, is the overwork is celebrated in these cultures. And I wouldn't even just say it's just tech in particular. I think it's more broadly corporate America and maybe just like capitalist structures in modern culture. It really is an extractive environment. And what I recognized was over time, like being in these environments for as long as I was, they will always ask more of you. So if you give and give and give of yourself for what, for the next promo, for a higher bonus, for longevity within that company, what is it that you're actually giving in exchange? There's a value exchange there. There's an energy exchange there. And what I notice time and time again with myself and with clients and with my colleagues is they end up giving so much of themselves, including their identity, to these organizations, that they don't have anything left for themselves to take care of themselves at the end of the day. And that, coupled with the stigma around mental health, keeps people siloed, it keeps people closed in, and it creates this very zero sum game in terms of the way people interact with each other. And that's the core of the reason why I speak about these things. It's like, look, I can be successful and also be struggling, and that's okay. And here's what that looks like. Here are the things that work for me. Here's what my journey has been, and in hopes that it gives someone else some courage to be able to speak about their own experiences or ask for help if they need it.
And could I add to that? One thing I also practiced is thinking about, what do I want to do? And as you mentioned, in the corporate world, you're often thinking about, well, I'm going to get that promotion or whatever. Or popular thing in my head, I can't wait to retire.
Yeah.
Like, I'm
Oh
30
man.
and I can't wait to retire.
Yeah.
And why is it that I'm waiting for that future of retirement? So what I thought about in this mindfulness, my own mindfulness practice is, well, imagine if I was retired, what would that be like? Like,
Mm.
what is it I actually want from that visualization of what retirement would give me? And the same thing with money. There's a powerful thing, like when you actually challenge, like, well, why do I want money? Which is like, oh, well, everybody wants money,
Mm-hmm.
success, right? But what do you actually want to do with the money? And what would you do if money wasn't an issue? Like, if you
Mm-hmm.
really had all the money you could possibly use, there's actually a scary realization that I had. Well, then I don't have to work hard. Then I have to really be intentional. Like, what do I do with my life?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be actually very scary, but I think that's a very powerful exercise to take. What do you want? Right?
Mm-hmm.
What are those goals? Why do you want them? Imagine you having them. And then pulling it back and saying, well, how can I get what I want there into my life right now?
Yeah.
So if you want that flexibility in your life, if you want to have that freedom from retirement to not always feel stressed, how can you put that back into your life right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a poignant thought, and it's ironic in some ways too, because literally the week before I got laid off, I had just completed my 5-year plan. And this is something I do on kind of like a semi-regular basis. Is it's to answer that question of like, all right, well, like how much longer can I? Well, the question that I had in my mind was much longer can I survive in these environments? Which just in its own right, that question is, to me, tragic. Like that is the frame that I was approaching it from. How long can I survive? It wasn't like how long can I thrive in this environment, and how can I grow and expand in this environment. It was like, how much longer can I just deal with it and take it? And I had figured out roughly about 5 more years is what I could probably put into it. And then at the end of that 5 years, I was like, yeah, I'll step more fully into my coaching practice. Maybe I'll do a startup, maybe I'll travel more often. And then like literally a week later, I got laid off, and it was like, oh shit, like, all right, well, now it's a 5-month plan instead of a 5-year plan. And your point is really well taken. I mean, it was that exercise that got me thinking about like, well, what would life look like after this career that I'm currently in? And it looked very similar to what I was already living. It didn't have that day job as part of like the mix. So yeah, as soon as I got laid off, like thankfully I had already had that plan B in place, and I had already been sketching that out. And I take it to the nth degree. Like I will really go all the way to like the far reaches of a particular plan and run all the scenarios, think through all the possible solutions, really go to like the heat death of the universe side of things as much as I can to like think through like, okay, well, like how would I respond in these circumstances? So once the layoff came, which also was like one of my biggest fears, was being laid off. Like the entire time I worked at Google, I was afraid I was going to get fired, like literally the entire time. And my entire modus operandi there was to do things which would prevent me from getting fired. It was a good run. 13 years was a good run in that. But like, what a way to move through life, right? In fear and in scarcity. So, for me, it was like, all right, well, if I didn't have fear, if I didn't have these restrictions, and if I really wanted to step into something that was meaningful and gave me purpose and had impact in the world, what would that be? And it was like, oh, it's like, I'm already doing it. I'm just doing it in a very small capacity, and I'm doing it internally within the company. So that's basically why I'm doing the work that I'm doing now. It was like, this was part of my plan B, and this was part of my vision of like retirement per se.
And I want to dive into your plan B in just one moment. I just have one last thing that I'm drawing from what you're saying. What I reflect on now being out of the corporate world is there are great things about it, right? You learn how to be very efficient, and like the dorky things that you saw me prepping for this podcast, that's part of that, right? I learned how to
Yeah.
be very efficient. But reflecting back on this, and I just had this conversation with a friend, I set limits on myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being in the corporate world, my definition of success was that next level. How am I comparing myself to another person
Mm-hmm.
who's at that level? And that was very limited. And you also feel like, oh, I need to change myself
Yeah.
to be successful in this environment. And then you leave it. And I know that, to your point, it's very scary. Like the whole layoff thing, like, oh, you leave it and you realize there's a world of opportunity. There's a world of people I can interact with and impact. So my scale of impact is so much broader.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that anything against the company, but like that's why I also encourage people to talk about, let's talk about plan B. And even
Yeah.
if you're working, to start thinking about what can I do now to explore that plan B? You can see both of us are like, that would have been great.
Yeah.
Because you can see that your limits are actually much higher
Mm-hmm.
than you thought are possible if you are only in the corporate world. So
Oh
let's talk
yeah.
about plan B and why it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, oh geez. So what you're touching on, I think, is so critical. And I always, there's two kind of metaphors maybe that I've approached this from in my past. I think it's like the indoor cat versus the outdoor cat, and I think that I was telling you before you jumped on the podcast, like I have this outdoor cat that lives in our front yard. It's a barn cat. It's not even our cat. It's somebody else in the neighborhood takes care of it and just lives in our front yard. But it really, really wants, I think, to be an indoor cat. Maybe I'm projecting. I don't know. But like I spend a lot of time with this cat out front, just trying to normalize its experience and trying to like soothe its nervous system, and to like build trust. And it reminds me of like what it feels like to be an outsider within one of these corporate organizations. Like I didn't join Google voluntarily. Like I actually joined it by accident. I started as a temp, a contractor, and then a vendor. I had been a freelancer most of my career previous to that. I had my own company before I joined Google. And I actually had to be talked into joining by a couple of friends of mine. And they were like, look, you have to take advantage of this opportunity. If you don't do it, none of us are going to be able to do it. So like you have to take advantage of this. So that was kind of my inroad into it. And I had always thought, I was like, this is going to be temporary. Like maybe it's a couple months or maybe it's a couple of years. And then suddenly 13 years rolled by. And during that period in time, the thing that I actually noticed is the scope of my role reduced and reduced and reduced. When I first started working at the company, it was a very different company back then. And I had an amazing amount of responsibility. I had all this autonomy. I was able to wear multiple hats and do multiple things. And then over time, my job kind of just got like limited down to this role that essentially I was basically copying information from a project management tool and putting it into a presentation for leadership. And that was my job. And I was like, this is not utilizing my skills well. And there was this interesting combination of different types of burnout. Like I had all three types of burnout at the same time. I had overwork burnout, I had underwhelm burnout, and I had neglect burnout. And it would kind of flip back and forth between those various different modes. But the underlying feeling that I had was like my potential was being squashed and limited. And I think that square peg round hole is the other kind of visual metaphor that I've often felt. It's like, yeah, you can fit yourself into a shape that's not natural to you, but there's damage required in order to fit yourself in there. Those sharp edges get rounded off in order for you to fit into the form that that environment allows for you to be in. And I think over time, a lot of folks that I talk to, what they experience is like a shifting of the values that they hold as an individual and the values of the organization that they're in. And it's that not quite fittingness or that othering, like that outdoor catness that they experience, that I think causes a lot of grief and a lot of mental health concerns for folks. And, for me, the plan B and kind of building a plan B was like a vote for my future self. It was this, I know this is temporary. I know that this isn't really a container that's going to fit me long term. What would that look like moving forward? And it was a process, an iterative process over many years, but a lot of it was kind of an envisioning process of like, well, what would that life be that I would want to live? Not like from a tactical standpoint, but more of like, how would I want to feel? Like, how would I want to think about myself? What types of people would I want to be surrounding myself with? What kind of impact would I want to be having? Some people talk about it as your tombstone, writing your tombstone. Like, what would you want someone to say on your tombstone? And I saw a graphic recently, a cartoon, and it was this tombstone. It said, was born, very busy, died. And to me, that was like this really interesting, shocking moment of like, is that really how I want to look at my life? That's basically how I looked at the last 10 years, was like, I was very, very busy. I was afraid the whole time, and it still got me laid off, So when I talk to clients and when I kind of think about my own plan B, and I always am working on a plan B, I really try to encourage people to think about this in terms of like the best possible version of yourself, the best possible scenario moving forward, and use that as your North Star to kind of aim for. It can be aspirational. It can be something that's kind of pieced together over time. And I'm proof of that. I built my coaching business one client at a time over several years, one training at a time over several years, until suddenly I had all this free time after being laid off. And it was like, oh, great. Like, I'm basically ready to go with my business. And then I was just about like getting online and, starting to publicize that more regularly.
Oh, that's so much wisdom there. I'm just reflecting on all of that. And I'm so selfishly glad that this happened to you in the best way, because you now are sharing your wisdom more broadly in this open space. And it sounds like there's a lot of growth that this opportunity kind of forced you to have.
Yeah.
And again, I like that it fast forwarded that 5-year plan into a 5-man plan. And would you mind sharing with me, like, not even just the highs, because we can talk about that all the time and people see you doing well, but what was that real process for the 6 months, especially for people who are like, hey, I got laid off.
Yeah.
And to me, what you're saying feels really far off. Like, I see you guys smiling and all of that, but right now I feel lost. Like,
Sure.
I am struggling. Can you, not that I hope that was your process, but if, just want to see, like, what is that process and how can we give some wisdom to some people who are maybe in that space right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would even take it back. So interestingly, and I agree, I am very glad that the layoff happened. I think it's been a real blessing for me as an individual. I was not particularly keen on the way that it happened. Like, an email at 3:00 in the morning isn't the way I would do a layoff necessarily, but like, hey, that's their choice, right? So good on them. But, I think for me, the process of mourning and grieving the loss of Google started years prior. I had been at the company back in 2010 when it was still essentially, I think it was like 30 or 40,000 people at the company. Right before I left, I think it was somewhere around 180,000 people or something along those lines. It's a different company than it was when I started. And around 2015 or so, when I actually got hired full time, is when I started to see the culture of the company shift and change. And that grieving process actually started around that time, because the company that I joined, the don't be evil, googly company that was all about like bringing your full self to work and like, having the opportunity to flex into what they called 20% work and offer things like mindfulness and meditation, became more difficult over time. And, roughly around the middle of the pandemic, I actually had a mental health collapse. And this was due to a handful of different reasons. One, the team that I was on was incredibly toxic and unhealthy. The leadership team that I was working out with was completely unsupportive. And I had underlying anxiety already, which just with the pandemic and everything else that was going on, all of that just became incredibly amplified. And then I made the unfortunate decision to start taking some medication for IBS, which is also something that's related to stress and burnout and all those other things. And that medication basically tipped me over the edge into panic and anxiety attacks, paranoia, and essentially like I had a mental health breakdown. And I took 3.5 months off, which was the longest time I had ever not worked in 12 years at that point. And that is really when that process started for me. It was a process of allowing and accepting what was happening. It was a process of letting go of what was and that version of myself that I was living into at that point. And it was this realization. And I had even gotten to a place at one point during that mental health collapse where I was like, I'm not going to be able to do anything other than bag groceries. Like my brain is not functioning at a level that allows me to do any kind of deep thinking of any kind. And I had found peace in that, where I was like, all right, like I'll just bag groceries or I'll wait tables. Like I've done it before, right? It's not a big deal. And luckily, I discovered that this medication that I was on was actually causing the vast majority of the disruption. Once I stopped taking that, it was like the clouds parted. But what it left behind was the work that I had done of accepting and releasing and allowing. So the whole year after that was a process of putting myself back together and rebuilding myself. And this is really the advice that I would give to people that have experienced a layoff. You know, a layoff and a mental health collapse, I think, are really similar in some ways. It's this massive event that occurs in someone's life, often without forewarning. And it's not like it's not a moment in time the way that I think a lot of people think about it. It was like, oh, there was a layoff that happened. It was on this date and on this time. It's a period of time. It's an ongoing evolution, something I'm still in the process of working through right now, much like a mental health collapse. So that whole year leading up to my layoff, between my mental health break and the layoff, was a process of me doing that inner work, doing the plan B. Like, what is it that I would like to really be doing with my life? How do I want to feel? How do I want to be thinking? Who do I want to be surrounding myself with? What are my values? What are my non-negotiables? Like, what are my boundaries that I either am holding or not? And that started to put together a constellation of things that became a rubric for me to discover, well, what would I do after Google? And for me, what came up was like, well, the best time in my life was when I was in business for myself. The best time in my life was when I was of service of other people. And the times in my life where I felt most like myself was when I didn't have a boss or I didn't have a manager, you know. And I think underlying all of that, and this is part of the reason why I named my podcast what I named it in my newsletter, I never wanted to be in a situation again where my performance was being evaluated by anyone other than my client or my business partner. And that radically shifted for me, like what the choices were. It was like, all right, well, I can go out there and I can apply for another corporate job. I can maybe go work at a startup someplace, or maybe I just do my own thing and kind of see how that rolls. I've done it before. Why not try that again? And now that I have a little bit of a severance to play with, they give me a little bit more of a runway. I'm kind of been talking about it like Google basically paid me to create my own startup.
Funny you say that, because I was thinking, well, there's hundreds of thousands of people who are impacted by the layoff. What an amazing company all these people can form. And
Yeah.
we're lucky to have you go this route and choose you, and then see what everything has come about in just 6 months. Can
Yeah.
you share? Can we applaud
Sure.
you and share some of the things you're most excited about for the last 6 months, like learnings, people, like what has been your cool journey?
Oh my gosh, I've learned more in the last 6 months than I probably learned in the last 6 years. You know, it was basically, 3 a.m. on a Friday, got my email. I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to the bathroom, grabbed my phone, saw the email, and was like, oh gosh, like that's it. We're done. And basically, yeah, like just all of the feelings, all of the wave of emotions. In my mind, it was like Monday when I actually started working and building my business. But my wife keeps reminding me that it was literally the same day I was on LinkedIn, reaching out to people, networking and connecting. So those first couple of days, it was really just receiving the flood of outreach and support from people, and responding to that, and just truly trying to sit in that and feel that. And you mentioned in passing earlier, like the amount of support and community that has come from the layoff has been profound. There's the ex-Googler, Zoogler network. So there's a Slack channel and a Discord channel, which was really instrumental in helping a lot of us just process the grief and process literally like the to-do list of what happens after you get laid off, because the resources that we were provided from the company were just not really helpful. And then the outreach of people on LinkedIn by itself was really profound. I mean, it took me weeks just to kind of get through all the messages that people reached out to me from. And, I think I had the valued bonus of having spent a lot of time over the last many years building a network of people. I worked in the news space and the journalism space for many years while I was working at Google. And, I had thousands of people that were reaching out, offering condolences, offering support, offering job opportunities, all of these things. So that was really the first few days, was just processing all of that. And then basically on Monday, I hit the ground running. It was like, all right, let me get my website back up and running. Let me get my billing on the back end back up and running. Like this document is broken, or what am I calling myself? Like what title do I want to have? And then for weeks and weeks and weeks after that, if you tracked on LinkedIn my headline, which I know no one does, but like you would probably have seen 30 or 40 versions of that headline change over time. And it was this iterative process of like, well, how do I describe myself? Like what am I doing, outside of Google? Who am I? So that by itself was an interesting forcing function to get me to kind of think through a little bit of like, well, who am I without Google? Who am I without this title and without this role? What would it look like to craft a new title? And that's really where I started. I spent a lot of time in that headline. A lot of what I'm going to share is rooted around LinkedIn, because I basically live in LinkedIn these days. From there, it was basically kind of trying to figure out like, well, who is the ideal client that I would want to work with? And I'm a big proponent of teaching what you know, and work. Your ideal client is essentially yourself. That was me 2 years ago. It was like, how do I help that guy? What would he need to hear? What kind of support would he want to have? Get really clear about who that person is, and then started to do outreach for folks. So, luckily, I don't know if that's the right word, but everybody that got laid off was sending their layoff LinkedIn message, and a lot of people went through this. Some of them did it right away. Some of them waited a long while. And it was interesting to see how some people were like, oh, it took me a really long time to put this letter together. I wrote this 4 or 5 different times. I'm really embarrassed or shameful about sharing this. And to me, that was just like this open heart moment of like, oh my gosh, there's so many people that are really, really struggling with this particular event in their lives. I feel lucky because I already did a lot of this work and I had something of meaning and purpose to pour myself into. Let me start doing outreach to these folks and offering help. So that's kind of where it started. And then I had lots of probably 150 conversations with people that got laid off across many different industries. And it was like a no pitch call. It was just like, I just want to hear what you're up to. I want to hear what you're struggling with. Like, let me hear the words that you're using to describe your experience. I'll share what I've gone through and what I've experienced. So now I have this whole list of people who I still stay in touch with, pretty regularly on LinkedIn. That we had these early conversations, and that kind of started to help me formulate, what this might look like as an actual business. From there, it kind of shifted to, well, all right, I'm supporting people who have just experienced job loss or layoffs. So I created a group coaching program. I have 9 really lovely people that are in that group. And we're, I think, in week 6 right now, moving through all of the feelings and all of the grief and all of the things that come up through that experience. And then I started focusing more on one-on-one clients. And I'm kind of straddling 2 potential markets right now. I'm focusing on people who have experienced job loss and layoff, as well as people who are still stuck in unhealthy teams, because that's what I have the most experience with. And, from there, it was this process of all right, let me work with somebody. Well, let me back up. One of the things that I think was also really important for me was whatever I did next, I was going to focus on my strengths, not on my weaknesses. And focusing on the weakness part for me means finding a contractor to do that work for me. So I spent a little bit of my money and a little bit of my severance on working on my copy editing on my website, figuring out who my ideal client is and how to speak about them. So it was the bio on my page, it was my website, it was all these different pieces to create essentially a system or a process which can attract people and get them into a sales funnel. And from there on out, it was basically this iterative process of refinement. And I think over top of all of that was this other kind of element of a promise to myself to write daily on LinkedIn. And the reason for that, Anya, was the last piece of feedback that I got from my manager before I got laid off. We had gone through this whole performance review. They had just changed the performance review process. And I had what was called a support check-in, which is a terrible name for this thing, because basically what it was a flag to leadership that this person is not doing well. At least that's how I took it. And the conversation that I had with my manager at the time was like, it was essentially like, Nick is accomplishing all of his objectives and all of his expectations, but he requires too much coaching from his colleagues and from his manager. And this was in the people development org. So just from a philosophical standpoint, I thought that that was like a little askew. But then like when you go a little bit deeper into the feedback, it was essentially like my emails were sometimes too long and confusing. And the presentations that I was creating for leadership took too many rounds of revision to get where they needed to be. So for me, I always considered myself a pretty decent writer. And it was like, well, in order to kind of prove to myself that I actually can write, I'm just going to write and I'm going to do it every day. So it's been 100 some days now since I got laid off, and I've literally written every day since.
I'm listening to this, and can I just repeat some of the points that stood out to me? If
Yeah.
that's okay. One thing that I want everybody to hear is the power of community. And we'll just talk about the Changing Work Collective in a moment, because that's an amazing community that you helped create. But if you're in this situation, again, I was laid off 4+ weeks ago. And to your point, it can be something that makes you feel shameful, that makes you feel really isolated. Even telling your friends, like people who support you, like, I got laid off. There's a sense of like, well, I did something wrong. Yeah. And that's not true. And what I found really helpful is reaching out, again, in the time of your own need, connecting with others who are going through that process or could use help, really helps you heal. So if you're in that place, reach out to people, even the people you don't know that well, and just like live that experience together. And you'll be amazed to see like how much that helps you and helps others as well. You don't need to offer anything, just that listen, that connection offer will go a long way. So I appreciate you sharing that. And yes, I was just thinking about other things, but I forgot them at the moment. So we'll talk about that. But also, when you're talking about your story, it's very vulnerable. And I think it's very powerful to hear. One thing, I was just looking at these recordings. And again, I'm starting this podcast, very new. I'm really hoping it helps others. But I have my own insecurity. And we talked about, I talk really fast. So when I looked at the recording of the podcast, I was thinking, okay, Anya, you're going like 3x at your 1x speed. And it bummed me out, right? This is something I want to do. I want to offer value to you and everybody and promote their message. And here I am not feeling good at what I'm offering. But you know what? I have people who I met in the last 4 weeks who are empowering me, who are giving me that entrepreneurial support. And they're saying, well, what can you do to improve? And that's the thing. Like when you go on your plan B, this is a side tangent, you can find your strengths and areas you want to build in, and you own that. You don't have to be perfect for them to make that plan B work. And that's what I'm doing. I'm like, well, how do I slow down? Google search. I'm going to read poetry. I'm going to practice. I'm going to look at these videos, which are painful sometimes, and keep working at it, right? That's how we all grow through our struggles. And that's the same thing with your writing. Now you have this accolade at LinkedIn, and people look at your posts and like, well, that probably comes very easy to Nicholas. Like he's writing all the time. That must have been easy. But no, it's a process, right? For all the plans B, start with things we want to do, things that maybe we're not even perfect about, but we're just dedicated and putting in the work.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing that I would add to that is just understanding it's a process. You know, whatever that process is for you. For me, it's LinkedIn writing. You know, somebody else, it could be something else altogether. But, you know, I throw that stuff out there feeling insecure and feeling incomplete every single post. Every single one that I do, I don't feel is good enough. And that's fine. You know, like that's okay. The point is pushing it out, even though it's not perfect and even though it doesn't exactly meet the standards that I would like it to be at, because I know it's an evolution and it's a process of growing and learning.
Absolutely. Okay. I side tangented you enough. So let's talk about Changing Work Collective. And I also want to hit on your podcast, the Needs Improvement Podcast, which I love just the name and everything. So let's start with the collective. What is that? How did that come about?
Yeah, so that was an evolution of its own right. So Scott Shute, who was the head of mindfulness and compassion programs at LinkedIn. He was also a VP at LinkedIn for many, many years. I had come across him through a variety of different environments. The meditation and mindfulness community is actually a lot smaller than you'd think it is. So there's a lot of overlap between the work that we were doing, the people that we knew. And we had actually been working previously on another endeavor called the Mindful Workplace Alliance. And essentially that was a group of people like myself who were managing mindfulness and meditation programs within their companies, like Meta, like Microsoft, like Google, Toyota, a whole bunch of other ones. And really, it was designed as a way to share best practices, to share guidance, and to kind of create a bit of a playbook around how to scale these types of programs within your organization. Once I left Google, it didn't make as much sense for me to kind of be a part of that because I was obviously no longer managing that program or supporting that program. And we kind of got to talking. He had already this B2B offering that was available called Changing Work for Teams, a really beautiful self-paced course plus a manager guide to take people through how to build more conscious teams. And we got to talking, and it was like there's actually this amazing opportunity to provide value to folks like ourselves who are conscious entrepreneurs, who are trying to change work from the inside out and create a space for them to engage with one another, because it gets really lonely as a solopreneur. So first and foremost, creating a sense of community and a sense of connection between folks, also layering over top of that business development. So I don't know how many times people have asked me, like, how did you start your business? Like, how have you been as successful as you've been so far? And it's like, well, here's all the things that I've actually done. And it's like, well, what if we actually provided that to the community in the form of training and business development? So that's like a second pillar. And then the third pillar is really this idea of pulling from the collective the best practices, the best modalities, the best research and thought leadership to help inform what a B2B product might look like. So we basically just spun this thing up over the last several months. It started with just a couple of people, and then it kind of ballooned over the last several months to about 65 people that are in the group right now. We're planning on launching publicly within the next month or so. So by the time this podcast is released, it'll be on Circle as a community, and then we'll be opening up more broadly for folks as a membership community. So you'll still have the same access to other people of like-minded approach to the world. You'll have access to training and business development. And then eventually there'll be the ability to help contribute and be parts of larger offerings like courses or white papers or other types of research and thought leadership to help change work from the inside out. And really the whole underpinning of that is like, what would a conscious team and conscious business look like? How do we help that flourish? And how do we help support people that are thinking about these things as ways to reorganize the way that we think about work and the ways that we think about interacting with one another?
And I was just joining this group not that long ago, and I've had a chance to connect with a few people so far. And it's so empowering to see that these are people from all around the world. This is not just a US, people are having impact not just on LinkedIn, through a variety of sources, through a variety of world locations. And what makes me really excited about this is that you see another way to success.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just about you have to be competing against one another, or you have to, be focused on all this money. Like you see now 65 people who are passionate about something, they're helping others and they're helping each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very powerful. So I'm really excited to be part of this and see where this community grows.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think what you touched on there is like a really key point. There is enough work to go around. Like there is so much work that needs to be done in workspaces, from the mental health, well-being, mindfulness, conscious business, all of that. That it's never made sense to me to be like a zero-sum game kind of competitive type of approach. It's like, hey, here's everything I know, use it, be successful. Because the end goal isn't just for me to have a successful business, it's to help people at scale. So if we can help each other build our own businesses and provide ourselves with the tools and resources that we need to reach those people, that provides an outsized impact that none of us could do on our own. And maybe that's like the Google, programming scale at all costs kind of approach that I've been indoctrinated by. But I think it's a really valuable way of thinking about it. Like we're thinking about this collective, the Changing Work Collective, not as just another community or a LinkedIn pod. We're really thinking about it as a movement. So what does that entail? How big can you scale this thing? And how do you bring people in, whether they're conscious curious or whether they're, an advanced practitioner in this space? How do you bring them all together in a way that they can support each other towards this larger goal?
So I believe in the strong power of example, like just what we're doing here. you hear stories of people learning, doing something unique to themselves, and other people can be like, well, why can't I do something similar, right? Our
Yeah.
example gives permission for others to be genuinely them. And the last thing I want to make sure we hit up the Need Improvement podcast.
Yeah.
I want to hear all about that. I think it should be the Meow Meow podcast soon, but let's go with the
That
Needs
might be a
Improvement
second
podcast.
podcast. Yeah, the Meow Meow podcast might be a second one. Might just be called Outdoor Cat. We'll see. But like
Okay.
the needs
Okay.
improvement podcast is real. It does exist currently. I've got 4 or 5 episodes recorded right now. It'll be launching within the next month or two. And the whole idea behind the needs improvement podcast, needs improvement is a rating that you often get in corporate spaces. It's part of a spectrum of ratings that occurs, and it's usually the rating that you get when like you're not doing so hot, right? You need improvement. And personally, I think that performance reviews in general are just a terrible approach to personal development and career development. It's focused on the wrong thing. It's not focused on the things that you can improve. It's focused on the things you're doing wrong in a lot of the case. And, if it was more of a coaching type of a relationship, if you had a manager that all along the way was helping you, like, here's the things you're doing really well at, here's the areas that we need to coach you on, that would be a much different approach than saying you need improvement or this thing that you're doing needs improvement. So I really wanted to reclaim that term from a place of empowerment and really kind of flip the script on what we talk about when we talk about what needs improvement. In my mind, largely what needs improvement is the environments that people are working in that allows them to be their best selves, that allows them to be successful or not. And unfortunately, so many of these environments at the systemic level are engineered and created in a way that makes it really difficult for people who are not of a very specific type to be successful. So if you're neurodivergent, if you are an anxious person, for example, if you didn't have an Ivy League background, there's a lot of different reasons why you might not be successful in those environments. Maybe you're an introvert. Maybe you work better at home. Maybe you don't do well in corporate environments. Like, there should be a way for you to still be able to be successful without it being kind of a condemnation on you as an individual. So needs improvement, the podcast really focuses on the systemic structural issues within organizations that need change or needs improvement. It's talking to people who have experienced mental health or neurodiverse struggles within the workplace. And it also speaks to experts within the space who are trying to make a difference to make teams and make organizations healthier places for people to work. It's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves over time. I have just gotten started with it, and already it's been such an amazing set of conversations to talk to folks. But again, it kind of goes back to what I had been talking about earlier, raising the alarm, raising these voices in a way that helps destigmatize struggle within workplaces and really shines a light on some of these structural components which are making it difficult for people to be successful. That's the whole idea behind the podcast. And in fact, my newsletter, which is also called the Needs Improvement Newsletter, is also designed around the same thing. Here are the modalities, here are the tips, here's the research that's out there. Let's change the way that we're talking about what needs improvement and make work a better place to be.
I love that you're doing that. That is going to be, I can't wait to hear about this because it's such an important topic. And I know people will hear you in this talking about your challenges, and that will be impactful. But then you're diving into this. So I'm really excited. And I'm looking at the clock. We can talk to you for a couple more hours, but I'm going to be respectful of your time. So, where should people connect with you? How do they find you to get more of your wisdom, to follow the Needs Improvement podcast and all those cool updates?
Yeah, well, definitely you could find me on LinkedIn. I'm there all the time. So Nicholas Whitaker on LinkedIn, pretty easy to pull me up. You can also find me at my website, nicholaswhitaker.com. If you're interested in signing up for the newsletter, there's a spot right there to sign up for the newsletter within my website. And then very shortly, once I release the podcast, you'll be able to subscribe to the podcast there and also anywhere that you follow or subscribe to podcasts. So it'll be pretty broadly distributed.
I can't wait. I'm going to share all of that in the description and also keep you posted. And was there anything that we missed? Any topic that you want to bring attention to before I wrap it up with some 3 rapid fire questions?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think, like just the one thing that I would leave behind for folks is like, if you're experiencing job loss, if you're experiencing a layoff, if you're experiencing an unhealthy team, and you're asking the question of yourself, like, what do I need to do differently to fit in? Or what do I need to do to change to be better here? I would encourage you to kind of flip that a little bit and really think about
Mhm.
what needs improvement in your environment to allow you to thrive. A plant can't thrive with soil that isn't fertile. And I think
Mhm.
that exact same thing applies to the workplaces that we live in and the relationships that we have. So I would just encourage folks to kind of like take that lens, focus it a little bit more outward. It might be a little bit of what you need to work on, but my guess is it has a lot more to do with your environment than anything.
Super powerful. I hope people are thinking about that, reaching out to you and working with you for more support on that if they want it. And we're going to wrap it up with 3 rapid fire questions. I
Yeah.
always preface the third one, think about it in a positive context,
Yeah.
just as a little hint. So, first and foremost, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay. What motivates me the most is
Being of service.
easy, love it. Success to me is
Ah, that's a great question. Success to me is being in alignment with my values and being in alignment with the type of environment that I want to create. Uh, I'd say it's not a maybe a rapid fire answer, but I think, for me, it's really about knowing what my values are, knowing how I can be most of value to the world and aligning my choices and behaviors with those values. That to me is what success means.
perfect. I love it. Okay, last one. Going off track is
Oh yeah, going off track. So I spent a lot of time off road doing adventuring on 4x4 trails, and just being like hundreds of miles out into the wilderness. So for me, like that idea of being off track is a gift. It gives you the opportunity to be innovative. It gives you the opportunity to be creative. It gives you the opportunity to rely on your training and rely on your practice. And I think a lot of times people feel like there's some track that they're supposed to be on. Uh, Maybe that's based off of what their parents told them. Maybe that's what society has told them is like their path and their track. And I think the more off track you can get, the more you can kind of get a sense of like what the other tracks are that are out there, and you can choose the track that feels right for you at that time. It's a wayfinding process or a journey, if you will. But yeah, I think being off track to me is like an opportunity, and it's a real gift.
well, thank you. This was so fantastic. I hope you learned something. You got to see Nicholas and what an awesome human being he is, and just genuine and so insightful. If you feel like you're struggling in any of these areas, please contact him, reach out to him. He has great services. There's also a great community, as I heard about. Listen to his podcast. Like, I promise you, you will learn something and find your own kind of empowerment throughout the journey that you're on right now. Also, feel free to tag us. He's also on Twitter, so I'll make
Mhm.
sure I'll comment that as well. Again, ask us questions. Let us know what stood out to you and how it can be part of your journey. So thank you again for joining us, Nicholas. Thank you for everybody listening for being right off track. Look forward to next time.
Thanks so much, Anya.